Do what thou will be the whole piece of law.
Welcome, comrades, to the massive powder keg known as Yugoslavia, a country containing every problem in the Balkans compressed unhappily into one nation, until one glass bottle lit the fuse that would lead to its destruction. But it was not always this unhappy as people like to make it out to be. It was only slightly unhappy from when it was first founded. Mimicking the empire that it was founded from, it was warped by the trauma of the Second World War, and from out of that depression came a new era of prosperity and experimentation. But it couldn't last, and after this period it laid fertile ground for a 1,000-year-long racial memory to rear its ugly head once again, to let farmers grow and harvest these sentiments, harvesting a collapse that would last a decade and beyond. But I can't talk about this amazingly fun and happy topic without giving some content warnings. Obviously, being a video about Yugoslavia, this will contain ethnic tensions, ethnic hatred, and other nasty words involving Serbians, Albanians, Croatians, and Turks, along with many other ethnic minorities in the Balkans. Yay! Also, don't think you're getting away without some territorial disputes. Territorial disputes involve basically all of the Yugoslavian successor states, but honorable mentions go to the independent nation/Serbian autonomous region of Kosovo. And general warnings for discussions of bodily harm, sexual assault, and horrible pronunciations of Slavic names. Even though I am trained in the language, I'm not trained in Serbian Cyrillic. So I apologize if these are a little off or majorly off, but I will try my best. But without further ado, and despising that these are actually required nowadays, I can finally put to page everything I've learned over the past week of feverish research, and I was compelled to make this video because all the discussion I've seen about this topic is it being played for a gag, which is fair if you're outside one of the Yugoslavian successor states, and I'm guilty of it too. This story caused my sister to break up with her boyfriend when I told her at a New Year's party, or at least if it's not my fault, I'm going to take credit for it. But this has the same punchline as fascism, right? All of them look funny and strut funny and have really funny beliefs, and then 5 seconds later it's 1,000 people died in the United States bombing campaign of the dying Yugoslavian state, right? Isn't that a tonal shift? So I want to put it in a broader context and give it that dark comedy aspect for those in the West who view the Balkan racial memory as one giant meme and a massive mine of endless humor, and for those in the Balkans try and show both sides as unbiasedly as possible with some dark comedy in there to keep it a little lighter than the Minecraft abyss. So I'm going to be upfront, a lot of Western media is biased towards the Serbian interpretation of things. However, I have tried to check my biases and acknowledge what is going to be coming out of this to give both sides a fair chance. So I hope that comes out in the script, but please correct me on anything because I do not live in the Balkans. I just think this is something that needs to be discussed. It is opening the door to a more important discussion. So, how to pick a starting point? I could just start at the Ottomans just to emphasize how far back this goes, or even earlier if I wanted to emphasize how back this blood feud goes, just in general Balkan terms. But I'm going to start at the formation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, starting with Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian, blah blah blah, First World War. I hope you know all this stuff, but there are a couple important things you need to know. First is a man named Peter I of Serbia, a man who was voted into the monarchy after the old king was assassinated, ending his entire royal bloodline by an army officer conspiracy. He was known for liberalizing the kingdom and giving Serbia unparalleled freedoms and cultural development. He gained titles such as the Liberator or Uncle Pera, a perfect, unblemished leader to begin the foundations of a state looking to put the past aside. Really, the only thing that could be said against him is that he lacked any sort of political initiative, but that never tarnished his image in the public's eyes. During World War I, the idea of a state for the Southern Slavs, aka Yugo, Southern, and Slavia, land of the Slavs, or if you want to translate it, land of the Southern Slavs, was forming in Austria-Hungary, originally starting as a vague idea to reform the diarchy, aka 2 crowns, of Austria-Hungary to a triarchy, 3 crowns, with the third crown being not Austro or Hungarian, but rather a South Slavic Confederation state to balance the Austrians and the Hungarians. This movement was pioneered by Croatians and Slovenes within the empire, while the nation of Serbia lied officially outside of Austro-Hungarian control. A Serbian minority was involved in this confederation as well, but there were already disagreements over the ethnic identity of the state that was to be, whether the Serbs, Slovenes, and Croats were all one identity and thus should get one centralized state, or were were different enough to each get federalized states inside of one nation. But that would require them to have a nation first, and it would require them to eventually break free of the Austro-Hungarian Empire if the triarchy could not be achieved. This being considered was almost impossible, and the feelings simmered until a few weeks after the First World War began. The Austrian Empire declared war on the Serbians. After their ultimatum was refused, the Serbians called on the Russians. World War I things. I'm not going to focus on that. That is a completely different topic that has had so much ink spilled over it. Over 100 years after World War I, people are still discussing it, so I'm not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole because this is already something that I've had to gloss over a lot. To get more to the point, they formed the National Council of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, drawing it from purely within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Seeing this formation, the nation of Serbia, outside of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, having their nation shelled within minutes of the start of the war, issued what would be known as the Nice Declaration, submitting their war aims to the world, which included liberating parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that contained Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes. Well, what about Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bosnia? Well, Northern Macedonia was already a part of Serbia during this time, and the other groups Serbia figured they could absorb into a Serbian ethnic identity, as they were not ethnically established enough to have their own nations. They were looking to form Yugoslavia under the phrase, "A strong Serbia is a strong Yugoslavia." However, Serbia would not last long, as 1 year later in 1915, Uncle Pera would retreat through Albania and Thessaloniki and retreat to the island of Corfu, where they would begin funding of a Yugoslav committee in Austria-Hungary to advance Yugoslavian interests within the empire, ran by a man named Ante Trumbic, being a Croat by birth. However, at this time, most of these ideas were never taken seriously by the Entente powers as a whole, as they wanted to keep Austria-Hungary around to balance out Germany after the war was over. However, as the war grinded on for 2 more bloody years and the Entente softened the idea of bringing a separate peace to Austria-Hungary, this idea began to crystallize more with the introduction of American ideas of self-determination. However, even this idea could not be so simple, as the Serbian state, seeing the winds of change moving towards a separate peace with Austria-Hungary, the losing of Russian support and thinking that the triarchy would come to pass in Austria-Hungary rather than have a secession of the Slavic states, Serbia would send their Prime Minister Nikola Pasic to the committee for negotiations on how a future Yugoslavia would look. He was even contested early on by the committee by not being allowed in until his intentions were clear, as the committee suspected that he was coming in on a greater Serbian agenda rather than a concrete Yugoslav agenda. The committee also had pressures on them as well. With Italian pressure for Dalmatian lands being promised for Entente membership, the committee needed more support from a more powerful state. Pasic and the Serbians desired a centralized government around the already existing Serbian structure, with universal suffrage and parliamentary democracy, which is not something I expected to see. However, the committee disagreed with this due to the Serbian majority, and not wanting to surrender their rights, they sought a more federal system with emphasis on local autonomy and separate legal institutions, mainly championed by the Croatians, being the strongest ethnic identity within the South Slavic states in Austria-Hungary. Most of the committee members saw the universal suffrage and parliamentary democracy proposed by the Serbians as a velvet glove way to establish a greater Serbian idea, which had been an idea lingering in the back of the Serbians' minds basically since the country began to exist. So, over 28 meetings, Pasic made his intentions clear. If federalism was the goal of the Yugoslavian Committee, then the Serbians would abandon the committee and seek out a union of ethnic Serbs instead, choosing to pursue their greater Serbian ideal. And unable to square this circle, as will become a pattern in this story, no concrete solution was given for this declaration that they were about to give to the world. And in May of 1917, this declaration was issued by the Yugoslav Committee, now renamed to the Yugoslav Club, called the Corfu Declaration, which glossed over the problems and disagreements that the committee had had, with a notably Serbian tone, speaking of qualified voting majorities, with a Serbian king, presumed to be Peter I, or his regent Alexander, at the helm of the future state, called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. In 1918, after the collapse of Austria-Hungary, as the treaties were being handed out to the Central Powers, the Council of Slavic Nations would negotiate with the regent king of Serbia, aforementioned Alexander I, about the creation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Using the guidelines established in the Corfu Declaration, a proper constitution was cemented in November of 1918, which Alexander signed and agreed to, and thus began the existence of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Wow. wow, that's not even the part I wanted to get to yet. And there's still so much to go before I even get there. Okay, it's time for a perspective shift. I want to focus on an Austrian conscript who fought in the First World War. No, not that one that you're thinking of. This one. His name is Josip Broz Tito, a Croatian, and his story begins by being captured by the Russians. Now, this was not a normal tour around POW camps until he was eventually freed at the end of the war. No, no, no. This is too common for Mr. Tito. He would proceed to walk out of an unguarded POW camp uncontested and arrive in Petrograd just in time for the Bolshevik demonstrations. Now, being an escaped convict, he would have to put on a disguise. So, he pretended to be a Russian and participated in the demonstrations, avoiding capture and fleeing over 3,000 kilometers, or around 1,000 miles, and ended up in Omsk. When he arrived in Omsk, he was informed that Lenin had taken control of Moscow, and hearing this, he immediately signed up with the communists and got married. He participated throughout the Russian Revolution until he moved back to his home in Croatia, which was now a part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, where he found all of his familial connections had either died or left the country. So, he joined up with the CPY, aka the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Now that he was back home, the troubles never really ended, but merely transformed. Now, the people who imprisoned him were Yugoslavians rather than Russians, and more prison hijinks ensued as he was arrested for communist agitation. I apologize if it feels like I'm skipping over Tito's upbringing and amazing backstory, but I really do want to focus on his later life and influence, rather than his fun-time Saturday morning cartoon adventures in prison. Just think about it more as a foundation for a dedicated video on Tito, because I genuinely love this guy. I mean, look, his portrait's above my video recording setup.
Look, it's my editing setup. There he is. He's right there. He's right there. He watches me edit. Isn't that so cringe?
As purely a joke for this video, I thought it would get me in the Yugoslavian mood, and it really did. But I do need to instill in you how much of a hardcore communist he was during this time, as he eventually ascended to the head of the CPY before the start of World War II by avoiding the purges of the CPY leadership by Soviet authorities, which is a whole nother comedic story for a different time. However, when Yugoslavia was invaded during the Second World War, Tito would lead an explicitly communist resistance, and over the course of the war he gained so much popularity that eventually the reigning king in exile of Yugoslavia recognized Tito as a figurehead of the movement and told all other Yugoslavs to follow suit, which would lead to all of the allies in the war to do so as well. Now, after World War II and the German occupation, which its consequences will be felt later, but they aren't really important now, and really the only thing you need to know if you know anything about Balkan history is it's just war crimes on top of war crimes, empowering ethnic minorities to do things to other ethnic minorities. It's an awful cesspit of terrible, which could also probably be its own video, and that I'm going to gloss over because frankly, it needs to be posted somewhere that isn't this platform so that I can talk freely about what happened. But coming out of this entire mess, Tito would take on the title of the Liberator, and he would look out upon Yugoslavia and see all of the havoc that the Germans had caused, as the Germans had annexed and tried to integrate the Slovenes as a Germanic peoples, the empowerment of the Croatians and the Ustasi to do so many war crimes that I can't even list them all, and the splitting up of Montenegro to give nationalists something to cling to, as well as Serbia being divided up and occupied, saw a massive upwelling of nationalist sentiments by Serbians and many other ethnic identities throughout Yugoslavia unseen except before World War I. And more importantly to the story, the geographic area of Kosovo was annexed to Albania. Now, this is a surprise tool that will help us later, but Tito had his work cut out for him, taking a new stance in the reconstruction of Yugoslavia, coining the phrase, "A weak Serbia is a strong Yugoslavia." Now, if this were 99% of other Balkan leaders during this time, I don't think they could have accomplished what Tito did. And what he did astonished everyone with its simplicity and the fact that everyone just went along with it. He said, no more ethnic tensions, and people just went along with it. They all agreed. Tito was seen as a grand unifier and a firm believer in the Yugoslav idea. So the fact that the Croatians had once been empowered to oppress the area under Germanic oppression was not an issue, because Tito was not seen as a Croatian, but rather as a true Yugoslav. And the wave of good times would continue, as Tito brought about his massive wave of economic liberalizations to the communist system, creating the system of what we know today as market socialism, which is almost as deeply ingrained in the soul of the former Yugoslavia as Tito is, as all of the Bosnians, Croats, and Slovenes that I've ever met who have ever had any connection to Tito through their parents or visiting the territories have mentioned both of them within the same breath. Tito took a stance of non-alignment, trying to milk the benefits from both sides, and generally succeeded in milking both Moscow and the IMF of everything that they would give him. Tito also allowed the free movement of peoples throughout Yugoslavia and beyond. Anyone who wanted in could, and the Yugoslavian passport could get you basically anywhere. And also a small footnote, those things you don't really think about, but other things that Tito did are ushering in a greater era of literacy, taking it from below 50% to 91% underneath his reign, established free healthcare, and thus improving the life expectancy about 30 years. It makes you begin to ask yourself the question, is there anything that Tito couldn't do? Well, as if to invite fate with that horrible question, in 1974 there were some undercurrents flowing in the country, spearheaded by two men close to Tito, his left and right hand. His right going by the name of Alexander Rankovic, and his left being Edvard Kaldeji. We'll start with Rankovic, an ethnic Serbian who was known for his iron-fisted policy of centralization, wishing Yugoslavia to be a centralized Soviet-style state with as little federalized division as possible, limiting democratization or any reform whatsoever. He is also known, either glowingly or tyrannically, because of his pet project managing the geographical area of Kosovo, where being an ethnic Serb could not put away his ethnic hatred for the Albanians in what he perceived to be Serbian land. He sought to correct what the Italians had done during the war. If you remember, they annexed it to Albania, which had disproportionately affected the demographics in Rankovic's eyes. However, he did not do this clandestinely. He decided to shade it as purging Soviet allies from an unaligned Yugoslavia. However, this was actually an attempt of forced rehabilitation of Albanians to Albania and Turkey, as well as Serbians and Montenegrins to Kosovo. His uncompromising nature and close to clandestine violation of Tito's ideas got his membership to the Communist Party of Yugoslavia revoked in 1966. He was put on trial, and being framed as a traitor to the Yugoslavian ideal was made quick work of. However, the papers would not be so kind, as they framed him as secretly desiring a greater Serbia rather than the Yugoslavian ideal. And if you know anything about what I'm about to discuss, being the Constitution of 1974, it might be kinda obvious who won, but come on, please stay with me. Kardeji, on the other hand, Tito's left hand, if you'll remember, was all for individual autonomy of the Yugoslavian republics, and being one of the key theorists behind market socialism, was always close but never too close to Tito. He joined the party at an early age and quickly rose. As being born Slovenian, he was able to replace a very scant Slovenian wing of the CPY after Stalin's purge, and given Rankovic's fall from grace, was given the reins of the final Yugoslavian constitution of 1974, the longest in the country's history, which in very brief terms, and only keeping to the things that will be relevant to this story, gave all power to the working class and the people. It introduced a reorganized governmental structure and named Tito president for life. However, most of the power rests on the first principle of government laid out in this constitution, giving every republic in the nation the right to self-determination, even the right to secede if all the other republics agree, which fundamentally altered the way that Yugoslavia was held together and gave fuel to the nationalist undertones that had underscored the nation since its founding. However, Tito managed to make it work by holding to his earlier saying of a weak Serbia is a strong Yugoslavia. He looked down at Kosovo and Vojvodina and gave them their own administrations, judiciary, representation, and veto power in the Yugoslavian parliament. In all but name, they were republics, but on paper, they were only empowered autonomous provinces. And by never settling the idea of Serbian sovereignty over these areas, as a running trend in this story, you will begin to see a concrete resolution was never established and left the door open for people to come up with their own solutions afterward. Now, after all this setup, I can finally get to what I wanted to do in the first place. So, in 1980, Tito dies, and Yugoslavia adopts a new saying. After Tito, Tito, saying effectively that Tito's ideas would continue even though he was gone. And as we turn our eyes to the geographic area of Kosovo, where at this time about 77% of the population was Albanian and 13% were Serbians, the rest are other ethnic minorities, this would begin to set the stage of what was about to transpire. Now, in the years after 1980, Yugoslavia tried to make After Tito, Tito work, but without Tito's active suppression and straight-up aura, the federalization of the 1974 Constitution began to become detrimental, with the smoldering coals of ethnic conflict beginning to warm once again after being cold for so long. And on the 1st of May, 1985, something happened that resulted in a man named Dordje Martinovic crawling into a hospital in Gian, in Kosovo, telling a story that comes down many different ways, but I'm just going to combine all together to give you a jumbled version of every possible scenario that could be, and then I'll split them up later. So, the jumbled version goes like this. Dordje Martinovic crawls into a medical center in Gian, possibly after rising from unconsciousness, with a broken bottle of mineral water or beer wedged where the sun don't shine, claiming to be tied down, possibly, and assaulted by two Albanians, which can also be referred to as Kosovars, possibly for not selling his property, as these two assaulters allegedly came several times, and he told them every time that it was not for sale. The local majority Albanian public authorities then condemned the attack. Now, this story has been told many ways, both humorous and serious, but regardless of how it's told, every version of this story seems divorced with major time skips. So I want to try and give it as much context as possible and tell you why it is important, as my best source for this is a book called Kosovo, How Myths and Truths Started a War by Julie A. Meritus, along with many other books that I cited in very minor capacities for the Rashomon effect that I want to try and illustrate for this story. So first I'm going to present each story, given rationales, but I'm going to lead with the official report, or the closest thing we have, with the Danas articles, which is a Croatian weekly magazine, reporting. But I will also tell you it omits many key details that Albanians and Serbs will need to support their arguments later. So the two varying perspectives that will come after this Danas timeline will include various supporting details that Danas did not include. It also has a nasty habit of stating everything that they find is absolute 100% true fact, which is not just unique to Danas. Yugoslavian media had a trend of doing this, and a consequence of that is that it led to very black and white interpretations of events. So, with that bias out of the way, Danas's narrative goes as such. At 5:30 p.m., a medical center in Gian informed police that they were treating a man named Dordje Martinovic, an ethnic Serb who claimed to have been assaulted by two Albanians. The next day, the Secretariat of Internal Affairs, hereby referred to as the SUP, were deployed to perform an investigation where they obtained zero hard evidence, neglecting to take wax footprints or take fingerprints from the bottle, but were apparently good enough despite this to compensate. 3 days after this, the highest authority in Gian condemned the preconceived attack, as well as putting out a criminal complaint and stating that an official SUP investigation had begun. Following this, there was a statement from the SUP saying that Martinovic had done this to himself and that the municipal conference followed suit in calling this a self-inflicted wound. Following this, later in May, Martinovic was charged with making false criminal complaints, followed by an official SUP interrogation, where Martinovic stuck to his original story where he claimed to have been assaulted by two Albanians. The next day, the SUP investigator brought a state commissar and interrogated Martinovic with permission from the state judge. Martinovic then changes his story, putting on the record that his injuries were self-inflicted, and that he was merely looking to cover up his own failures as a man. There's about a lull in coverage for about a month, leading us back to June. The state chambers of Kosovo then say they would not release the results of the investigation. So then, a few days later, it was turned over to the VMA for a second medical opinion. In case you're wondering, that is the Military Medical Academy in Belgrade for a second opinion. A month later in July, the medical opinions conflicted, as the first opinion said that the wound could have been self-inflicted, and the second said that self-inflicted wounds should be ruled out. Thus, a month later, in August, a third opinion was requested requested from the Skopje Institute for Forensic Medicine, and a month after this, the judge on the case demanded that all 3 opinions agree, but all 3 would hold by their original writings, thus requiring the judge to request a 4th opinion and return 2 weeks later, with the 4th opinion refusing to rule out either option, which left an opinion deadlock. And for the final and most prudent time, by failing to give a concrete opinion, they poisoned the entire future of the nation forever by failing to settle this, as you now get the Rashomon effect of 2 different ethnicities looking at this from different ways. So after the official federal opinion, what are the ethnic interpretations of this incident, and what do they use in the absence of supporting official evidence, if you can call Danas official by any means? So let me flip a coin to see who goes first, just to remain as unbiased as possible. Heads is gonna be Albania, tails is Serbia. Alright, Serbia goes first. So the Serbian tale is one wreathed in metaphor, but it goes somewhat like this. Martinovic crawls to a medical center in Gion after rising from unconsciousness with a broken bottle of mineral water or beer wedged where the sun don't shine, claiming to be tied down and assaulted by 2 Albanians for not selling his property, after they had allegedly came several times and he told them that it was not for sale every time. The local majority Albanian public authorities then condemned the attack, and the translation that the Serbians use has a lot of symbolism at work, so I'll try and give you the historical context. Going back to the Ottoman Empire, remember them from the beginning of the video, dominated the Balkans for almost 500 years, and the Turks in general have been interfering with the Balkans for even longer, far longer than you could ever remember, but they do. But there are a couple things you need to derive from this interpretation that make the Serbian version even more potent to a Serbian listener. The Ottomans were a majority Muslim country, which greatly interfered with the largely Orthodox Serb culture. The Albanians are also a majority Muslim, which leads to the tying of the 2 together in ethnic and religious identity. Secondly, the Ottoman sultans had large harems for royalty, as well as the idea of Eastern sexual deviance becoming embedded in the Serbian consciousness. The Serbian idea of the Ottomans latched onto this idea of a sexual deviance, and given the homosexual undertones of this case, that Martinovic may have done this to himself, and through leaps of logic, figured that any case of sexual deviancy could never have been a Serb, as their concrete Orthodox morality would have forbid them from doing so. Lastly is the idea of impalement, and Serbians usually translate the incident as impaled by a bottle, which would become a very prevalent phrase after this incident was never officially resolved, which invoked the distinctly Ottoman tone in the Balkans. You see, the Ottomans used impalement for punishment or intimidation purposes. Thus, in the Serbian view, Martinovic was punished for a crime he did not commit, or was left there as an intimidating message for the Serbians to find. This ties into the idea of the wouldn't sell property, as it is another part that only becomes effective after this, as the for sale sign would become a sign of Serbian oppression, as the myth goes that Serbians would be forced by Albanians to sell their property at robbery prices just to get Serbians out of the Kosovo area. Serbians would also point out that Martinovic's confession was coerced by Colonel Ivanov, and as said by Martinovic and his family after the fact, Ivanov had promised them jobs and other benefits if he would own up to his crime. His family also came out in this statement saying that Martinovic was a grandfather at the time of the assault and had no prior signs of sexual deviance. Taking all of these ideas, as well as the VMA report and the 4th opinion in stride, were ready to claim a conspiracy against Serbs from the police all the way down to the most lowly Albanian, that the authorities were unwilling to assist Martinovic and thus the rest of the Serbian minority in Kosovo. And as a failure to identify the perpetrators, this made all Serbians feel cornered and unprotected from a hostile and predatory Albanian majority. So, what is the Albanian perspective? Well, here it is, presented with just as much legitimacy as the Serbian interpretation, as I don't think one of these is more correct than the other, and I don't want to give an opinion as someone who is completely uninvolved with this. So here is the Albanian version, presented with just as much authenticity as the Serbian version. Martinovic crawls to a medical center in Gion with a broken bottle of mineral water or beer wedged where the sun don't shine, claiming to be assaulted by 2 Albanians, and the local majority Albanian public authorities condemn this attack. However, upon investigation by by the SUP and local party commissars, specifically Colonel Ivanov, Martinovic confesses that he had faked the attack to cover up his sexual deviancy that he had. And in fact, he had only gotten where he did because he had affixed the bottle to a stake and sat upon it, using his body weight to self-inflict the wound. And he only came up with the story to blame 2 fake Albanians that never existed when it went wrong, because that would be the most believable. Taking the medical opinions of local authorities and the plausibility of the 4th opinion to back this up, as well as touting other magazines from Belgrade, the capital of Serbia nowadays, these magazines including Večernje Novosti, Politika Express, Communist, and Duga, promoting the narrative of a self-inflicted wound as the definitive one, as well as accusing the Serbs of doing what they historically have done, which is finding things to rile up the Serbian minority in a majority Albanian area to find reasons to bring back Rankovic-era oppressions and deportations for the extraordinary situation that had come to pass. No matter how much of a statistical rarity this assault might have been, with Kosovo being the lowest in Yugoslavia for intimate crimes and assaults and violent crimes as a whole. Finally, since the perpetrators had never been found, in addition, when Albanians had bought Serbian land as well as Serbian residences, they had paid above average prices for doing so. Finally, since the perpetrators had never been found, it was in the zeitgeist that every Albanian was responsible, the ambiguity fueling the fires of hatred in the area, and opening the door for Rankovic-era oppression to resume with utmost zeal. Now, after this, we will take on another saying, not coming from any Balkan figure, at least not in the traditional sense, but this one comes from Napoleon. Après moi le déluge. After me, the flood. Because after this, any ethnic action from Albanians in Kosovo was no longer an assault against the Yugoslavian state, but rather reframed as targeted acts against Serbia. And this would go as far to say that there was a genocide going on in Kosovo, perpetrated by Albanians against the Serbian minority, which led to Serbian intellectuals and Serbian Kosovars submitting petitions and legal action to protect ethnic Serbs living there, even going so far as to publish a 485-page book about the Martinovic case, selling 50,000 copies over its print run time. However, Albanians would not sit by idly, and they retorted with a cry of greater Serbian hegemonism, calling back to the Kingdom of Serbia that had forcibly united all of the other ethnic minorities underneath a Serbian flag, and that this entire stunt was being used for Serbia to gain more land than it rightfully deserved, and that it would use any excuse to try and expand its grasp within Yugoslavia. Nobody saw a better opportunity to advance his political career with this situation than a man named Slobodan Milosevic, a man you may know for being a massive war criminal in the years that would follow. However, at this time, he was merely a Serbian from Požarevac. He had worked his way up the communist system to being the party president of the CPY in Serbia in 1987. 4 years after the case had started in 1989, he would propose constitutional amendments to cement Serbian control over Kosovo and Vojvodina, both of which passed. However, knowing what we know about Kosovo, you may be asking, how in the world did this pass? Well, in the wake of the Martinovic case, Milosevic used it as an opportunity to diversify the police forces and bring in a new ethnically Serbian police majority, which were present in the chambers for the vote. Classic. And with his ascension to the president of Yugoslavia in 1991, he and his allies controlled 4 of the 8 republics, and he was able to force through many laws that benefited Serbia, including outlawing criticism or ridicule of the Serbian state, bringing back the phrase, "A strong Serbia is a strong Yugoslavia." And this is when the curtains begin to close on Yugoslavia. As Serbia and Albania wishing to strengthen their ethnic identities, it drove the other republics to do the same, with the socialist majority losing to many different ethnically oriented parties, and only 1 year later, Croatia, Slovenia, and Montenegro would secede and bring about the Yugoslav Wars, which would not cool down until it finally settled in the early 2000s around 2008, with everything still remaining a shattered remnant of what came before. Yay, the joke is war crimes, yay! I also wanted to work in a joke because I remember seeing an article during Trump's first presidency where it's like, oh, Trump said the N-word, and I was like, oh, really? And then I looked and it said nationalism, and I wanted to put that as a joke in the video, but it kind of seemed like it would have broken the flow, so just know that I could have put it in, but I didn't. I wanted this to be a little more factual, darkly comedic. Hopefully I managed to pull it off well. Hopefully I managed to represent both sides equally. I think that's something that I really wanted to try. This could have like 5 sub-videos. The collapse of Yugoslavia, there's so much ink spilled on this topic as a whole, but I put a lot of effort into this. So if you want to see a larger Yugoslavia video, let me know. I love digging into Balkan ethnic conflicts, even though I am not Balkan, I just have a lot of Balkan friends. So I would kindly ask, in the name of the Marshal, please like, comment, and subscribe. 1 subscribe equals 1 Yugoslavian AK for $600. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. I'm trying with a new style. I hope I get this out on time. If this video comes out on the 24th, you'll know that I had to wait, or maybe I'll just write from script and publish it on Monday, who knows. I might need a couple more days, but if it comes out on time, it'll be a miracle. I had to spend so much time scripting, I don't know if I'll have enough time to edit, but whatever, it's not your problem. Go have a good day, go out and call your grandparents. Talk to them, ask them their opinions on Yugoslavia. It's a great opportunity to learn, especially if you have some Balkan friends. It's a great opportunity to rile them up if you're just that annoying person who in school you're like, man, I love riling people up for no reason. That's me. Anyway, have a good rest of your day. Call your grandparents. I'm sure they miss you because I can't call mine anymore, so. 85,000 children died in Yemen.